Okay, well, hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to see you. Many of you have participated in our events before, and it's wonderful to have this opportunity to convene again. My name is Lori Krupp, and I am the Donor Engagement Officer, and I'm so glad to welcome you here today with Father Charles Curran and Tom Fox. So it's good to see everybody here. Today's event was especially created for you, our donors. We are so grateful for you and all the support that you lend to National Catholic Reporter. You know, a lot of people don't realize that because we're independent, we don't receive funding from religious orders or dioceses, and that's actually what preserves our independence. So we really treasure the idea that we're supported by our readers because we wish to serve our readers with our work and what we do. So I really want to take the opportunity on behalf of all of my colleagues at NCR to say thank you. Thank you for what you do, and thank you for making this work possible. Before we begin, we'd like to pause and say a prayer. Seems like an important day to pray with everything going on in the world. I'd like you to imagine if we were all in a church somewhere ready to begin this session. This is the moment where we would pick up our coffee and go to our family or friend and find a chair together and sit down. And this is the moment when we kind of become this unique community for this session today. So as we gather spiritually, as we gather in our hearts from the East Coast of the United States all the way to the West Coast, let us for a moment unite in prayer. The book of Second Chronicles says that the eyes of the Lord run to and fro, always watching the earth. And on this day, we ask those eyes to rest on the Ukraine, to rest on those who are so scared right now and alone. We ask the eyes of the Lord to rest on those in power, and to rest on those who are in need, who are hungry, and to rest on those of us who have blessing. And even as this session goes on, may our hearts be united with one another and united with all who are in the eyes of the Lord this day. Amen. Thank you for being, thank you for praying. At this point, I'd like to introduce our two presenters. Father Charles Curran is at the Elizabeth Sherlock University Professor of Human Values at Southern Methodist University. He has served as president of 3 national professional societies, the American Theological Society, the Catholic Theological Society of America, and the Society of Christian Ethics. He is a priest of the Diocese of Rochester, New York, and he has authored and edited more than 40 books in the areas of moral theology. Father Charlie has taught for more than 20 years at the Catholic University of America and has taught at Cornell and the University of Southern California, as well as Auburn University. Father Charles has asked that we call him Charlie, and we will be doing that today. Tom Fox is editor and publisher emeritus of National Catholic Reporter. He has been an editor or publisher for most of the years between 1980 and 2015, then again in 2018 and 19. His reports from Vietnam appeared in the earliest issues of the National Catholic Reporter. He has also reported for the Washington Star, the Detroit Free Press, Time Magazine, and the New York Times. I also want to say, in addition to the official, the unofficial is we're about to speak with two visionaries today, and two people whose lives are kind of both theological reflection, the intersection of what we believe and how we live. And so I'm so delighted that they're both with us today. Tom, I'd love to ask you to start us off with answering this question. This idea for these sessions was your brilliant idea, based on your reading of Father Charlie for many, many years in his book and his most recent book. And I'm wondering if you would share with us why it is that you wanted to have these sessions. What was the impetus?
Well, thank you, Lori, for the introduction and for hosting us. And I also want to acknowledge the audience here of faithful NCR supporters and readers and people who've really invested their lives in this church of ours. I did a little math, and I added up the number of people who had signed up and the number of people who are on the call here, and it comes to over 1,500 years of church involvement. 1,500 years. So we have a real community, an invested community. And so I want to acknowledge this group who's come today. And of course, it's an honor to be with my old friend, Charlie. And I have to say right up front that it's Charlie's a theologian and I'm not. And it's daunting to be able to ask questions of a theologian, and I don't claim to have the expertise that Charlie has, but at least I can ask the questions, and I feel boosted by the fact that we go back at least to early 70s, mid 1970s in Washington together when we first met, and Charlie first appeared on the front page of NCR in I think 1967. When the Board of Trustees at Catholic U was trying to oust him, and the faculty and students were so upset that they actually closed down the school. And then again in 1968, he was the spokesperson for, I think it was some 60 or 67 theologians who had a dissenting view. That number grew over time, but initially it was in the 60s of dissenting theologians to people who were opposing the conclusions of Humanae Vitae. So, but I would like to start by going way back, even before the council, which is going to be a very important part of this conversation. And Charlie, I'm wondering if you could just briefly say something about your own family and childhood and how you got involved in the priesthood and eventually into theology.
Well, in terms of family, I was born in Rochester, New York. My parents had both been born in New York City, and my father moved to Rochester to work in 1926. And there are four of us in the family. Two are dead and two are still living. And as I said to my younger brother when we buried my sister, that, well, I'm the next one, and then it's you, but time will tell. Our family was Catholic and committed in various ways. And I went to Catholic school and then went into the minor seminary, but I'm a little nervous about that. I mean, I wouldn't do it today, but I did it then. We lived at home in those days, though. And then after philosophy, they sent me to the Diocese of Rochester, sent me to Rome to study. And I was ordained in Rome in 58, and I was to come home in June of 59. But I got a letter from the bishop saying that we want you to stay in Rome and get a degree to teach moral theology in the seminary. And as a dutiful, obedient, pre-Vatican II person, I saluted and said yes. Actually, I really had no interest in teaching. I didn't want to teach. I wanted to work in a parish, but I got into teaching because I was ordered to do so. And so I spent then 2 years at the Gregorian University and at the Academy Alfonsiana. And it was probably the two people who influenced me the most there were Bernard Herring and Bernard Lonergan. And Herring had just written in German, The Law of Christ, which was later translated into 18 languages or something. And it was an attempt to make moral theology primarily how you live the fullness of the Christian life, and not just what's a sin or a mortal sin or a venial sin. That Lonergan early on, well, not early on, but later after the council, because I started, in fact, I left Rome with my doctorate in '61 before the council even started. But after the councils, Lonergan wrote a fascinating article and said, what changed at Vatican II? And his answer was somewhat startling. He said, well, we moved toward historical consciousness. We used to think in terms of the immutable, the unchanging, the eternal. Now we began to recognize historical development, change, etc. And I found that to be just very significant. And I have depended on that through much of my intellectual life.
So let's drill down on that just a second. I think you've said or have written that the Vatican Council tried to bring together religion and spirituality or something to that effect. And I think that whole idea of discerning the spirit, the signs of the times was speaking to this idea of the Spirit telling us through our actions and who we are, what this church is or how it's becoming. Is that part of this sense of historical consciousness that you're referring to?
Yes, I think in many ways, Tom, it is. But perhaps the most important thing the council did on a specific issue was to say that all Christians are called to perfection. Too often in the older church, we said the people who wanted to be perfect went off to the monastery or the religious life, and everybody else, the ordinary Christian, stayed in the world and obeyed the 10 Commandments. And the council said, no, by baptism, we are all called to be disciples of Jesus, to love God and love neighbor and serve one another. And that was so important. And then the historical consciousness comes into it precisely in terms of the signs of the times. That Vatican II gave great importance to the signs of the times, the contemporary historical developments that we live in and that we try to respond to. So that is especially where the historical consciousness came in.
Now, I guess there's so much to cover here, but you're talking about the council, so let's just talk about that a little bit. What were the theological dynamics at the council? I mean, not everyone was buying into this. I think I've read in the book or speaking to you earlier that you have the Thomists and you have those who were following Augustine, and that the Thomists were were trying to move the church forward. Could you explain that, give us a little theological basis to what was happening there?
Right. Let me just go back a little bit historically. I mean, the major issue was those who were trained in the old theology in the old church, and those who wanted to bring it up to date, the aggiornamento, the historical consciousness that we talked about. And I mean, and especially the American Catholic Church was really not prepared for Vatican II. We were a brick and mortar church. We were good at putting up buildings, but we had no idea of the changes that even then were beginning to come up from underneath in the church. And I remember one bishop, somebody said to him after the first session of the council, well, are there going to be many changes in the church? He said, of course not. Why break up a winning team? And I mean, that was sort of the attitude of many of the American people and American bishops. And but I think one of the great things about the council was 4 sessions over a long period of time. People learned what was going on, and they learned from one another and searched together for the call of the Spirit and the changing circumstances in which we found ourselves. I mean, I was in Rome when the new Pope John the 23rd announced the session that he was going to hold a council, and frankly, I didn't think much was going to come of it. John had announced a number of things. The first one was he was going to have a Roman Synod. The Roman Synod was god awful. I mean, that they came up with documents ahead of time, and all the priests of Rome did was vote yes or no, and mostly yes, about these documents. But they were old church. They didn't show any signs of creativity. But you know, the Spirit was working, and Vatican Council came and did things that I certainly did not expect it to do at that time. Now, it was during the council, the 2 groups that you mentioned, sort of the Thomist group and the Augustinian group. The Thomist group talked about the presence of God in the world, that the goodness of all creation. The Augustinian tended to stress more the reality of human sinfulness. And those 2 groups afterward sort of separated a bit, that they were together in the council against the neo-scholasticism that was existing at the time. But after the council, they separated out so that people like Ratzinger, de Lubac, and others were more of the Augustinian aspect of stressing or recognizing the greater presence of sin in the world. And the Thomistic group with people like Congar, Chenu, Curran, etc., were talking about the need to dialogue with the world.
When we hear about the Thomists, we think of natural law. And so within that context, they find the goodness of human beings and the potential for fulfillment, or for what the Augustinians have the concept of the 2 cities, and one city is good and one city is bad, and the city of the church is all good and the city of the world is bad. I mean, is that the dichotomy that
No, there is a tendency there. Yes, I mean, it's you know, in general, that's exactly what the 2 positions held.
Did this divergence occur during the council? You say after the council, but how long afterwards? And was that fostered by the election of Pope John Paul II?
No, it would have been before the election of John Paul II, because remember that John the 23rd died in 1963 after just the first session of the council. Paul VI came in 63 and was Pope until 79. So, and it was during that period that the differences between the 2 approaches came. A good exemplification of that approach was that in the beginning, there was this one journal called Concilium. And Concilium was, it included both some of the Augustinians, who were always a minor group or a lesser group, and the Thomists. But then after the first, so for example, Ratzinger was an early member of the concilium team. But then Ratzinger and de Lubac and others started a new journal called to take this more what you call an Augustinian perspective. So as a result, then you had sort of these two different journals representing these two different schools of thought.
And those two schools of thought have carried through until today. Has there been a divergence, or have there been breaking up of those schools?
Well, I mean, the shadows of them are still present, but again, since you moved on to so many more significant aspects that have to be dealt with, but there is, I would just say, there is that overall tension at times between those who are more open to seeing the goodness going on in the world and to dialogue with it, and the others who are fearful of the sinfulness of the world in which we live.
So I'd like to go back. Your book here, actually, we're covering 60 years now. This edition is unlike all other editions in the series, and maybe we can catch up on by can you explain what the purpose of this book was, the 20th volume?
Well, it was the 20th volume of a series which originally started with Dick McCormick and myself in 1978, whereby we brought together as a help to people who were teaching moral theology at the time, what was said in other articles that have been published, and brought them together under different themes. And those were Dick died after the 11th volume, but I continued it, sometimes alone, sometimes working with others. What this 20th volume was, it's the caboose, it's my last one. But what we decided to do was I would take just my own writings and show how those writings developed from Vatican II to the present.
So I think that the average layperson has a sense that the social teachings of the church have really been helpful, and in fact, I think that Jacques Maritain was involved even in the drafting of the Charter on Human Rights in 47 for the United Nations. On the other hand, and so I mean that there's this whole social teaching going back to Pope Leo, but on the other hand, we have the sexual moral issues, which are really alienating our children and turning off so many people. I would like you to go back to the theological fork, or the theological divergence of those two teachings, and why is one really contemporary or growing, and why is one not?
All of this in 30 seconds, right? Okay.
Oh, we have not only this, but we'll be able to. We'll talk in more detail in the next session.
Sure.
I want to. Well, the impact of that divergence, I think, is going to set the scene for our Thursday. But I'd like to get the theological underpinnings of why that happened, or what it is that how did we go so wrong on sexuality?
Right. Now, interestingly enough, I mean, you and I share the same understanding of things, that the social teaching of the church seems so it's congenial to us and something that we embrace and support, whereas the sexual teaching is problematic. But there are other people in the church that are just the opposite. The conservatives love the social teaching, but don't like the love the sexual teaching, but don't like the social teaching. So at the very minimum, I think from both sides, then there's a recognition that there's a difference between the two. And I think if you examine it, you can see that difference. That what happened in the social teaching, the social teaching changed and grew. The sexual teaching never changed. And let me just do it. We already talked about the one aspect of historical consciousness. If you deal with historical consciousness, you are constantly recognizing you have to deal with the signs of the times, the present realities, and how these affect things and how we respond to them. A good illustration of this was the acceptance of religious freedom at Vatican II. Before Vatican II, we said no religious freedom, that there's a union of church and state. But Vatican II changed that by reading the signs of the times, a much greater importance to the freedom of the believer, the freedom of the person, etc. So that historical consciousness had clearly marked the social teaching of the church. It has not marked at all the sexual teaching. The sexual teaching constantly talked about the eternal, immutable, unchangeable law of God. And that therefore it was not open to the kinds of changes that would come when you recognize new things happening. And another good aspect of this, as indicated in some ways by the religious freedom, that the social teaching accepted the shift from the emphasis on human nature itself and like the sexual organs or the powers of the faculties was a technical word, like speech or sex or whatever it was. But whereas the social teaching talked about the person and the importance of the person. And I mean, we might talk about this later, but just as an example, one of the problems is if you look just at say the purpose of the organs or the nature, you wind up very easily saying that homosexuality is wrong. But if you start with a person who is homosexual, who is gay or lesbian, then that's an entirely different ballgame, because those organs exist within a person who has this orientation. And you're bound then to have a very different concept. But you see, in the sexual ethics, we never accepted these historical developments that had come along to realize that the sexual orientation is an existing fact that characterizes human persons.
You wrote something in here that I found very enlightening. The when I talk as a layperson, I say our social teachings go back to Pope Leo and Rerum Novarum, and it's like without examining Rerum Novarum, we think, wow, everything in there was just great, and it was really. And I think you make the point that part of the way the church operates is that the people, the church as people, either accept or reject the teachings over time. And the teachings that are accepted are continue, and those that are rejected die by the wayside. And I think that could you just speak a little bit about the Rerum Novarum and the various, what we kept and what we didn't, and why maybe some of that stuff has not been kept, and what that might say about the way the church actually operates and teaches?
Right. So for example, as you say, Rerum Novarum was dealing with the social issues. And it did really two significant things. The first thing it did was to say that the role of government is to step in and make sure that the poor people are protected. So it talked for government to set up a living wage kind of thing. And that was, a very significant thing. And that second, it talked about the need for labor unions, for people, the workers to organize together, to work together to accomplish their ends and goals. Now, actually, Leo XIII did a lot of other things that we forget about today. I mean, Leo XIII was strongly opposed to the modern freedoms. Leo XIII said the freedom of conscience is the sewer into which all garbage flows. Now, nobody quotes that anymore, huh? That because we didn't give enough importance in those days to the subject and the person. Later on in 1971, the papal teaching said that as time has gone on, we have become more impressed by the dignity of the human person that shows itself in the importance of equality, freedom, and participation. And so we recognize these developments and changes that took place in the social order, but we didn't do that with regard to the sexual.
And I think that that will be a focus of Thursday's conversation. But maybe I would imagine there are some questions people might have, and I'm wondering if Lori, if you want to relay some of the questions that our readers or our listeners might be having.
Thanks, Tom. So far, we just posted the note that folks can start asking questions. So I'm sure people will be responding. But I have one. Is that okay, or am I putting myself ahead of the line?
You're the boss.
Yeah.
Oh, well. One of the things that I've often wondered about in this area is why is it, what is it about us that we choose the whole area of sexuality? Why have we become fixated about that? Tom wrote me once that, when he and you were going to have a conversation, we were talking about sexuality, and I thought, oh, Tom, you wrote a book on sexuality. And I said to Tom, I thought all of our teaching on sexuality was just the word no, like that just seems to be it. And I so many times wondered, why do we obsess about this? Like, what is it that causes us to fixate on this and use it as a litmus test and everything else?
That's the great question. And I just think there are a number of factors that entered into that. First of all, sexuality is a strong human reality, and people can take advantage of one another very readily in sexuality. So there is a need for some type of regulation of sexuality. But as I say that, we're not the only ones. The whole Puritan tradition in the United States. The people who put the laws on in the books against contraception were not the Catholics. They were the Puritans in the 19th century. And now, there's no doubt that we also got into that fixation. And as I say, there were just so many factors involved. And part of it, and this might come up later on, was already mentioned, we haven't kept up with modern understandings of the meaning of sexuality. We haven't seen sexuality in terms of the person and the person related to others. You see, we saw it only in terms of the sexual power, or what they call the sexual faculty. But you have to see it in relation to the person and the person in relationship to other persons.
And
So a number of things really got us off on the wrong track.
but our concept of sexuality is pre-modern too, isn't it? I mean, it's just it goes back 3 or 4 centuries where we're looking at the womb as a kind of incubator for sperm, and I just wonder how the women's ordination issue and the whole differentiation, the binary differentiation between male and female is so strong, and it goes against what modern science really teaches or has learned about sexuality.
Well, but I mean, I think we still want to hold that there is a difference between male and female. I think there are 2 things behind your question there, Tom. The first is, no doubt, our theology was built on the biology of the time, and we never change with a change in biology. I mean, the very word that we used for the womb was the nest. The nidus was the Latin word for womb, and that was the nest. And all you did was put the semen in the nest, and it became the person. We knew nothing about the whole female reproductive cycle. We knew nothing about the fallopian tube. We knew nothing about the ovum. And I mean, so much of our theology, for example, the moral theology on male masturbation was all based on this importance of the semen. And so, I mean, there's no doubt that much of it continued to be based on a very poor biology, and that has caused us some problems. Now, I think the woman's ordination thing, again, it's very important, because I think this is the most significant practical issue facing the church today. I mean, I know so many women, friends and others, who have left the church precisely because of the lack of the full equality of women in the church today. And that this, in some ways, is perhaps, as I say, I think it's probably the most significant issue facing the church today, a particular issue. And the reason is because it affects 51% of the human population. I mean, that other things might affect 10%, 5%. Here you got over half the population. And that, again, the historical consciousness, as we've seen the role of women change in the broader society. I mean, now we in the United States aren't very good. We haven't had a woman president yet. I mean, many other countries in the world have had women leaders. We have not. I hope that has changed soon. But nonetheless, that there's the broader context here in which the role of women was not equal and was not seen as the right of women to participate in the fullness of the life of society. So it took society itself a long time to recognize the equality of women and their participation in every role in society. Now, that we have unfortunately not been willing to recognize that change with regard to life in the church. People make the argument Jesus never ordained women. Well, Jesus didn't ordain Gentiles either. In fact, Jesus ordained nobody. You know, I mean, that's crazy. That again, all these things are entwined, but we come back again so often to that historical development and changes brought about by historical consciousness and the signs of the times that we have to pay attention to.
Is it just the lack of applying the signs of the times, or is it the resistance of class that that the structure serves a certain group that wants to maintain that. And maybe that's a pretty harsh way of looking at it, but it seems to be the case.
Yes, although frankly, Tom, I think the primary reality here, the primary problem is the unwillingness of the Catholic Church to admit that it was wrong.
Right.
And unless and until we can admit we were wrong, we're going to be in trouble. And I mean, we have changed on so many things over the years. Perhaps the most glaring problem was the problem of slavery. It took us 19 centuries to condemn slavery. And I mean, just imagine, what the problems that caused. But that, thank God we finally did it, but we have changed on so many issues. We changed on taking interest on loans. We changed on the fact we used to say that a person who did something wrong had to publicly admit they did something wrong. There was no right to silence, kind of. All sorts of things we've changed that. And a good example might be religious freedom. In fact, I talked about religious freedom before, and I mean, there's the fascinating thing is that even Vatican II could not admit that the previous teaching was wrong. They said the circumstances changed. But sometime between 1875 and 1965, the circumstances had changed. We were, as I forget, I mentioned Lonergan before. One of Lonergan's great statements was, the Catholic Church arrives on the scene a little breathless and a little late. And we certainly arrived breathless and late on religious freedom. And that the teaching was, in fact, the document itself admits that. The Vatican document says that this teaching was true in the experience of Christian people before this document was issued. In other words, though, we couldn't say that we were wrong. We should have changed earlier.
So in a broader conceptual way, I've heard it said that Vatican II brought the church into the modern world, just as the modern world was moving into the postmodern world. And that this has even been a dynamic. And I think that when they say postmodern, it can mean many things, but I think in this context, it's the cosmology and the whole idea of the science and of how we see ourselves in the universe and how insignificant we are in one galaxy, in 100 million galaxies, etc. That this up and down order that Gene Kennedy used to write about, but has now changed the very way that we look at ourselves, and that's seems to be another challenge that I don't know if the church is even recognizing that.
Oh, I think, theologically it's recognized. I think Pope Francis has done a lot to recognize that. I mean, with regard to the whole issue of climate, the whole question of ecology, which had never been talked about before. I mean, that I think there is a tendency to be more open to those realities of the planet on which we live.
Yeah.
I'd like to jump in here. We're getting a few questions, and I'll ask two of them kind of as a one question, Charlie. When, what you've been speaking about with sexuality and change, two important issues, of course, are the issue of celibacy and the issue of women's ordination. Can you comment on the intersection of what you've been sharing about change and sexuality with those two things, celibacy, a priesthood, and women ordination? You've kind of somewhat done it, but if you could say.
Sure. I mean, as you say, they're somewhat connected, but really they're also, in one sense, theological sense, they're very different. And the reason is this, that we claim that the ordination of women, the non-ordination of women is a divine commandment. And celibacy, we admit, it isn't divine. Well, anybody with a knowledge of history knew that it wasn't there. Going back to St. Peter's mother-in-law, it's in the scripture. So that the celibacy is only a human law, and everybody in the Catholic Church has to admit that. Consequently, it's theologically much easier to change that than it is to change the ordination of women, because our teaching says that's God's law, not human law. Huh? Now, I don't think it is God's law. Again, it's that historical consciousness. Women did not have any kind of role in society in the time of Jesus. Huh? I mean, that you even have 4 times in the New Testament, you have those household codes that just repeated what was the accepted teaching of the time, that wives were subordinate to their husband. You had this hierarchy. There was the husband, the wife, the children, and the slaves. And that was the understanding at the time. And that time was also conditioned why women in society as a whole did not have leadership roles. But today, all that has changed. So that, I mean, I don't think it is a question at all of divine law, but because a lot of people in the Catholic Church think it is, it's always going to be harder to change the ordination of women than it will be the celibacy for priests. In fact, it's interesting. The German bishops have Cardinal Marx of Munich, the Batzig, the Bishop of Limburg. Limburg is really Frankfurt. But they and about 3 other German bishops have said we've got to think again about clerical celibacy. So people are beginning to talk about that, even bishops. Excuse me.
We have a canon law question for you. Canon law seems to be
Talk to your sister about that one. She's a canon law.
Canon law seems to be immutable. Most bishops are trained, are canon lawyers. The laws seem to be a weapon against change. Is canon law on weak foundation?
Sure, because I mean, a lot of it certainly is based on older understandings of things, and it shows that classicism I talked about as distinguished from historical consciousness. And therefore, we've always done it this way. Why change? And yet, if you realize, all the differences that exist, that in fairness, canon law did get revised at times, and it has changed somewhat. But especially when it's a question of church teaching authority, it hasn't changed. And that's where we get back to that issue again, that unless and until we can admit we have been wrong, we're still in trouble.
Wow. Well, we're coming to the top of the hour, Tom. Is there something more you wanted to bring?
Well, I just wanted to give a sense of where we're going to go. I mean, I think that one of the in Thursday or day after tomorrow, I want to put the conversation within the context of the upcoming synod and the issues, theological and other ecclesial, that we really face as a church going forward as we prepare for the synod. And if there's ways that we can better prepare our own country for the synod. But that's that, and that has to do, as you've noted before, with who's controlling the synod, but also what's accepted and what isn't in terms of theological possibilities for change, and I think that's an important one. I want to get back just to the beginning. I wanted to just give a word to the Paulist Fathers and Paulist Press for doing this over all of these years. What do you say, 1970? What was the first one?
78, I believe.
And I wanted to also read something that you wrote in the preface to this edition, and where you were actually expressing your gratitude to Paulist Press. And you said in here, "I'm most grateful to Paulist Press for their strong support of this series. My first piece I ever published in Moral Theology was a pamphlet, Morality and the Love of God, in 1962, which was a part of the Paulist Doctrinal Pamphlet series. Each pamphlet sold for 15 cents. And one of my friends claimed my pamphlet was not worth the price." I think it's characteristic of your own humility and your own sense of humor that that you have been so gracious and humble and giving when many church forces have been so cruelly unfair to you. And I just want to recognize that there are all of these people here who feel a great bond and affection for you, Charlie. And we're just, but the Holy Spirit works in strange ways, and you've had wonderful opportunities as well as unexpected opportunities, but nevertheless to be treated as you have been, that's a pain that I want to also recognize.
Mhm.
Well, thanks, Tom. But I've had an awful lot of support too. So so many people have encouraged me and supported me and prayed for me, and I'm very grateful.
And we'll talk a little more about the challenges that we face, but before we allow this to go at 48 hours on a negative note, I just ask you, as you get up day to day, where do you find and where do you see the hope that we hold out for as we are on this journey? We are on the faith journey, walking forward, not in control. And it's an act of faith sometimes just to wake up and continue the work that we do. And tell me where you find your inspiration, or where do you see the Holy Spirit?
Good question. Let me put it this way. In our talk even today, I've been quite critical about the teachings of the church, but I think deeper down, the Catholic tradition makes sense to me. And it makes sense in two reasons. First of all, especially in the moral theology area, it's always said human reason is important and human reason can help us. Now, as I've tried to point out, we haven't always used human reason in the proper way. But if you go back to say human reason is so important, that gives you the ability to be able to change things as they develop and to move onward. And then secondly, the problem is we've mentioned before, the reality of dissent in the church and in the Catholic Church being wrong. And here again, out of the old Thomistic, Thomas Aquinas is very clear on this point. And he raises the question, is something commanded because it's good, or is it good because it's commanded? And he opts for the first. Something is commanded because it's good. And therefore, any kind of authority, church-wise or civil-wise, must always conform itself to the good. That's why, for example, the Catholic tradition always had a place for civil disobedience, that the civil law could be wrong, And because it's not based on the will of the legislature, it's based on the reason of the legislator. And therefore, it could be wrong at times. So those two aspects of our tradition, as much as I've disagreed with some particulars, those aspects make great sense to me. And I think they give me the hope that change is always possible.
Thank you for that, Charlie.
Yeah. When I used to work on retreats and I would give talks to the retreatants, and I always brought up how when God created, God said, "This is good." And we hear it almost like approval, right? That God approves of. And I really think sometimes that really what God was saying was, this is what good is. You know, that the idea that, and I love how you said that just now, Charlie, that that's what we define ourselves and how we act by. This is what good is. And I love that.
I would add that the sacramental nature of our church, and there's maybe 7 official sacraments or what, but I see that's just I see the sacraments as windows into the divine, and there's hundreds, maybe thousands of sacraments. Every manifestation of reality that offers the possibility of deeper reflection into the divine is a sacrament, in my opinion. And it just makes so much sense, and it's so modern that we are very blessed to have this added element to our faith tradition, and that's just there's many others, but that the whole notion of seeing an ordinary and seeing the divine within that ordinary is really important for me. And it makes me also, to say nothing about this guy running around, Jesus, who said mercy and compassion and forgiveness are the core, and nonviolence are the core to being a follower. So we've got a lot going for us.
Yes.
But we face some problems too. And we can talk about both on Thursday.
Speaking of Thursday, we've had a few questions in the questions that we didn't get to, so maybe we could start with those on Thursday and keep right on. It would be a good bridge to the next conversation. I also wanted to mention at least one person I saw recommended a book in the chat room, and we'll certainly keep track of those things that people send, and we'll send you those after both sessions are done. I felt a little choked up when Tom shared what he did with you, Charlie, about, gratitude for you, and a lot of the work you've done has come at a personal price, and we are mindful of that. We are not often very kind to our prophets. And so thank you for being a prophet among us. And thank you for being so generous with your time, not just for these sessions, but for the writing you've done for us and the writing you've done for the church. We're really, really grateful. Thank you for being here today.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So I also want to thank my wonderful colleagues behind the scenes at NCR. It's always just so great to operate in confidence, knowing that they're an incredible safety net, and we're really grateful for that. Thank you. So Tom, any final words with this wonderful gathering we've had? And again, we put this together as an expression of our gratitude for our donors and for all of their support of our mission and independent Catholic journalism and our voice in the marketplace. Would you like to add anything, Tom, before we go?
I would be remiss if I didn't ask people to continue supporting NCR, and this is a community. Clearly, you can see this right here. This is a community within a community. And as with Charlie, it's dedicated to allowing people to have a free voice and ownership in their own church in in times when sometimes they don't feel that, and a place where they can come to for information. And I've been with NCR for some time, and Charlie has been a supporter. He's been a former board member, and Charlie has also a long time ago joined our Legacy Society, which means that he is mentioned, or NCR is mentioned in his estate, and I've done the same. And we'll talk more about that the next time, but I think it's just so important to be able to keep this community growing and alive, and to do that. And one of the ways to do it is by contributing or making sure that you take that step to put NCR in your estate plan. Maybe you can explain, you can talk about that next time, Lori, but I'm going on. I just feel so profoundly gratified by a group like this being able to come together to talk about faith and to talk about this journey that we're on, this mystery.
I love to share the story that when Tom interviewed me for this position, he said I would be going in his name sometimes out to places. And I asked Tom, what's the message I'll be carrying when I go? And Tom said, hope. And that has always stayed with me. And that's my prayer for us, is that we'll continue to be that voice of hope for the world. So may I send us off in a closing prayer? And then we will see everybody Thursday. So take a deep breath, everyone. And release. And a deep breath. And release. And a deep breath. And release. The eyes of the Lord rove over all the earth. And as we leave this day, may they remain with us. May our own eyes be open to ways that we can help move change forward. May our eyes be open to any ways we contribute in an unhealthy way to the problem. And instead, may all that we do and say bring forward God's kingdom on earth. Amen.
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 Thank you, everybody.